everyone, and welcome to our CIG TV studios. With me in the studio this morning are the Minister for Environment, the Honorable Wayne Panton, as well as the Director of the Department of Environment, Mrs. Gina Ebanks-Petrie. Thank you so much to both of you for being here with us. We're here to talk about an important subject, which is the National Conservation Law. In a nutshell, exactly what's the purpose of that law, Gina?
Donna, the law really is a piece of legislation that is attempting to be an overarching piece of legislation for environmental management from a conservation perspective for the Cayman Islands. So it's really about setting up protected areas. It's about establishing measures for protected species. It's about trying to create mechanisms that ensure we take the environment, our habitats and our species into account when we're making national decisions. And in doing so, the law creates a council, a National Conservation Council, in order to do that. So fundamentally, that's the core of the legislation.
Okay. And how long have we been at it? How long have we been looking at this law?
Well, I've been looking at this law since 1997, but I think that the public have been aware of the legislation since about 2002 was when the first draft bill was tabled in the LA, and that was by the former leader of government, Minister Bush, and we also had a white paper at that time. So that was when the first sort of public introduction to the law came.
Okay. Now we're putting out there for public comment at this point. How long is that process? How long do they have to comment and give their input?
Donna, the statutory or the constitutional requirement is 21 days. That is the period through which there is a consultation and a review of the legislation. We are taking the position that we need to have some time in order to decide, assess the comments and decide whether they reflect any necessary changes. So we have set November 29th as the time period through which we'd like to have written comments from the public. We're actually also going to be doing, beginning the week of December 2nd, district meetings to inform the public, to bring them up to date on exactly what this particular version of the bill contains. This process, as Gina mentioned, has been going on for a very long time. We've been, it's 11, 12 years now, we've been in consultation on the bill. And there have been various changes to the bill along the way, reflecting, because we've had, I call it a tripartisan bill now. We've had two different governments, a UDP government, two versions of the PPM government, and we also have input from the independent members now from Northside and East End on this issue, in addition to all the comments from the public. So it's very well reviewed at this point, and we're seeking to get final comments and issues that are of real significance and importance that we perhaps have missed. The bill at this point should be close to what we're looking to debate, and there will inevitably be some amendments in committee stage, as with any piece of legislation. As you're working through it and you get, your very final comments, there will be some changes made, but we want to try to minimize the amount of changes. We don't want any big policy issues to come up at this point, but we're going to go through. We're going to, the week of December 2nd, we're going to do district meetings, and we're going to go out and have meetings and advise the public, inform them, make them aware of exactly what the bill contains at this point.
Okay. I know that the environment is very near and dear to your heart, Minister Panton. From a personal view, why do we need a conservation law? Why do you think this is important to our islands?
Well, I mean, we have these international obligations. We have these multilateral environmental agreements that Cayman has volunteered to sign up to along the way since, I don't know, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We also have our Constitution, which was adopted in 2009, which essentially says that as a country, we aspire to protect our biodiversity, to conserve our lands and species where appropriate, there's no legislation at this point right now which protects our national, our plant or flowers, this sort of thing. Section 18 of the Bill of Rights also contains a very specific provision which provides that government must implement legislation to deal with biodiversity, to conserve and protect our flora and fauna. But besides all of that, as Caymanians, we all know we're all intelligent people. We have great common sense. We understand we are on 3 small islands. We have a tremendous value in our natural environment. We want to conserve it. We need to conserve it. We need to protect it as far as possible. And if we don't do that, as responsible leaders today, we are going to be cursed by the children of the future. I mean, it has an impact directly on our quality of life today, how it makes us feel as Caymanians, how we identify ourselves culturally, from a heritage perspective, from our environment. But the children of the future are going to lament the fact that we failed them in protecting it. What was the best of Cayman? We don't want to just leave them, what's left of Cayman. Right. If decisions are continue to be made, which don't inject conservation as a significant aspect of our consideration in our planning or in our development.
Gina, you care to add to that?
No, I think the minister's given a very comprehensive answer.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the MEEs for a few minutes. They've come up twice, once in 1997 and again now. Do the MEEs tell Cayman what to do?
No, they don't. I mean, these multilateral environmental agreements are sort of typically worded in ways that, first of all, in order to get sort of 97 or so countries to sign up to an agreement, the principles and the concepts and the commitments have to be fairly broad. I mean, they're pretty much sort of, motherhood and apple pie kind of things. We must conserve our environment to the greatest extent possible, that sort of thing. But there are specific agreements that we've signed up to that focus down on specific areas. For example, the Ramsar Convention basically places an obligation on the parties to that convention to manage the wetlands under their jurisdiction in a sustainable way. Now, so we hear a lot about sustainable development. I've heard a lot of rhetoric over the last 10 to 15, 20 years about sustainable development. But the fact of the matter is that we don't actually have a mechanism in place that ensures that environmental considerations are placed on the same level, on the same type of footing in terms of social environment, social considerations and economic considerations when anybody is making a decision, whether that be the CPA or whether it be cabinet. And that's what sustainable development is about. We often see the sort of symbol of sustainable development is a stool, normally a 3-legged stool, with the economy, society, and the environment as one leg of the stool. And what it means is that they have to be equally considered in order for the stool to be balanced, for it not to fall over. And I think that's a sort of a good visualization of what sustainable development is about. It means putting the environment on an equal footing with social and economic considerations when we're making our national decisions. And fundamentally, that is really what all of these conventions are seeking to do. Whether it's a convention on biological diversity, that has its focus specifically on conserving the range of species and habitats in countries. But they don't dictate to the Cayman Islands what must happen. They basically place an obligation on the government to take these things into account and to put measures in place to implement the commitments. Measures that make sense for us, though. They don't dictate what exactly the measures need to be.
That's always a good thing to know. So things have been mentioned about creating protected areas, for instance, Barkas National Park. How is that going to work exactly?
Well, I mean, the law has a a very extensive procedure and a process for the designation of protected areas. And I think that one of the first things that I would like to stress, and I'll invite the Minister to help me to answer this question because it is quite involved, but one of the things that I would like to stress is that the law, first of all, does not allow the government or the council or the Department of Environment to take anyone's land and put it under protection. Any land that is protected under this law first has to be owned by the government. And there are no compulsory acquisition procedures or processes specified in this law. Okay. So, Minister Panton, I don't know if you want to continue and...
Yeah, I mean, in the interest of full disclosure, there is a compulsory acquisition law or land acquisition law, which is completely separate. And that is utilized in the context of road corridor acquisitions. To my knowledge, this morning I was speaking to a former cabinet member, executive council member, and he confirmed that he's not aware of any other circumstances in which that law has been used to acquire land. And it is certainly and absolutely not the intention of the government to utilize that law for any acquisition of land in relation to the National Conservation Law for the purpose of protecting property. So, I mean, as Gina has said, the land has to be Crown land to begin with in order for it to be protected. We cannot just go out and take someone's private land and say we're going to engage in this process. And there's a significant process involved, which involves the public. There'll be a public consultation period. The National Conservation Council or members of the public can make recommendations about which land should be protected and identify it from an environmentally sensitive perspective and say this is why I think this should be done. And then if the National Conservation Council agrees, there is a significant public consultation period, and then it ends up with Cabinet, and Cabinet ultimately makes that decision as to whether or not a property becomes a protected area. But it has to be Crown land. If it isn't already owned by government and a piece of land has been identified as being environmentally sensitive, then government would have to engage, if it wishes, if it has the funds to do it, it would have to engage with the landowner and try to negotiate a normal arm's length commercial transaction to acquire that property. And after acquiring it, then it could consider whether Cabinet would be making a decision to make it a protected area.
Of course, the flip side of the coin would be if you have a very generous property owner who would say, well, our interest also lies in the same thing as yours.
There's always that potential. And of course, okay. I mean, I'll let Gina talk about it, but there's the ability to have an agreement with government to manage.
Okay.
I was going to say there are two other points I think that I would like to make. One is on the fact that the law does provide for landowners, as you say, who may not wish to sell their land but don't have any objection to their land being managed for conservation to enter into these legal contracts with government. So they get to retain ownership, but government gets to manage the land for conservation purposes. The law allows for that, and it can include, for example, that contract that is negotiated between the landowner and government, a provision for there to be some sort of lease arrangement so that the landowner can actually benefit financially from that agreement. As I said, it's basically a negotiated contract. Sure. But the other thing is, before any proposal is developed for a protected area, the law has been specifically amended to make it very clear that the landowner has to be notified and consulted before the proposal goes, as far as going out, for example, to public comment. So there wouldn't be a case where you as a landowner will be caught off guard that your property is out there being considered for a protected area. Right. You would have to the law now says specifically that the landowner has to be consulted prior to the proposal getting out into the public domain.
Right. And I would imagine, though, that could be quite difficult sometimes because You have some landowners who don't live in Cayman, who are off island, may not even have family, immediate family who are here. So I can imagine that it's a pretty tedious and can be a long process as well.
I think it will be a long process, the whole
Yeah.
question of designating a protected area, because, you know, as Minister Panton has said, it does have to go out for public comment. The council's required to take the public input into account before they finalize their recommendations to Cabinet, and then Cabinet has to take the public's comments into account. So it is going to be a lengthy process.
What about protecting our species? Are there enough protections, you think, in place for conchs, for instance, the iguanas, the blue iguanas?
Actually, those are two where we do have protections in place. So our marine conservation framework is actually more developed than the ability that we have to protect, any legal ability we have to protect species on land. So this is, as Minister Panton said, you know, this is one of the gaps that this law is trying to address. We don't have protections, for example, for any of our plants. Now, people have thought for many years that our mangroves are protected. People think that our national tree has legal protection. It does not. That our national flower, the banana orchid, has legal protection. It does not. None of our endemic species, that is the species that are completely unique to Cayman, only found here, nowhere else on the planet. None of these species has, from a plant perspective, has any protection now legally.
Wow.
And
there are national symbols.
And there are national symbols. And then we have on land, from an animal perspective, it's only our birds and our blue iguanas that have any protection. So all of the special creatures that inhabit the habitats that are around butterflies, our native mammals, our only native mammals, the bats, snakes, lizards, you know, the green and blue lizards that everybody knows and loves in Cayman, they don't have any legal protection. Wow. So, and they're actually, because they're unique and special and rare, they're actually the subject of quite a lot of interest by collectors, for example, for the pet trade from outside of the country. And we've had situations in the past where people have come here and have collected those species and tried to export them, and we were unable to do anything to stop them collecting them because there is no law that prevents them from doing that. So we had to wait until they got to the airport and tried to leave the jurisdiction, and we were able to get them under the customs law, which was good, but unfortunately the customs law has a very, very low fine for that. So that, you know, they just basically got a slap on the wrist.
So this new law is going to address all of those things, which is absolutely great. Well, you mentioned a few times about the Conservation Council. Who exactly is the council, and what powers will they have?
Well, the council is a 13-member body. It is made up of private sector individuals appointed by the Cabinet. 7 of the membership are appointed by Cabinet. One person is also nominated by the National Trust and appointed by Cabinet. And then the rest of the membership is from the civil service, taken from the departments, those technical agencies whose remits overlap with the remit of the conservation law. So, for example, obviously the Department of Environment is represented. The chief officer in the Ministry of Environment is also in the council, but so is the director of planning, and so is the director of agriculture, because those 2 agencies have, as part of their remit, bits of the conservation law overlap with their remit. So.
All right. Minister Panton, Mrs. Ebanks-Petrie mentioned to us about the council, the National Conservation Council, and who will be represented within that membership. But we wanted to address the powers that they will have exactly. So if you could explain to the public what powers they'll have.
Sure, Donna. Be happy to do that. Essentially, the National Conservation Council is going to be an advisory body. Any entity that is making a decision within Cayman which is going to have an impact on the environment would need to consult with the National Conservation Council and take into account their advice in respect of those decisions that they're making and the potential impact of them. That is all that's required, that they take it into account. It is not anything that dictates what the decision will be. So the entity, let's take the Central Planning Authority and the Planning Board as an example. They will consult with the National Conservation Council on applications. They will take their advice and their perspective into consideration. They can either make a decision which reflects that advice, or they can decide that there are other factors which perhaps outweigh that advice, and they can effectively sort of ignore the advice. Clearly, that's not necessarily the best thing to happen, but it is entirely possible. And I say that just to make the point that the council won't be dictating any decision in that respect. There's only one instance in which there will be the power for the council to effectively have its say and determine their end decision, and that is where there's a potential impact on an area which has been designated by Cabinet as a protected area.
So ultimately, it's Cabinet that has the final say.
Cabinet ultimately has the final say, and that was a significant change in the law following the periods of consultation over the last 10 years and 10, 11 years, where the decision-making was moved from the National Conservation Council to Cabinet. So the Conservation Council would advise Cabinet on areas that should be protected. Cabinet makes that decision. If there are other entities that are making decisions, the Conservation Council makes recommendations to them, and they must consider those recommendations, but they can ignore those recommendations if they decide that that is appropriate. But where they cannot do that is in relation to protected areas.
So, Minister Panton, effectively, the government is interested in good governance and transparency, and one of the ways in which the council is going to effectively follow those policies is by way of having the information made public. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, sure, Donna. I mean, I think this is an opportunity for us because we're creating a new entity. We're creating a National Conservation Council as a result of this law. It's an opportunity for us to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, in the context of transparency and openness. I think the bill doesn't currently say it, but one of the committee stage amendments that I am prepared to propose, and I have support from my colleagues on, is that the minutes and the agenda for the Conservation Council meetings will be publicly disclosed without redactions, so that it's all open and clear, and there's complete transparency. The law currently, or the bill currently proposes that the council can regulate its own procedures. We may even go as far as specifying that the meetings have to be held in public. And I think the only potential limitation there is trying to identify a venue where that would happen. But other than that, we would certainly be committed to the concept, particularly, as I said, because we're setting up a new council. This is now an opportunity to reflect the Freedom of Information law principles, and that is government in the sunshine and complete openness and transparency in relation to decisions which have a potential impact on the people of the country.
What about you, Gina? What powers do you have?
I don't have any powers under the law. I have an awful lot of responsibility under the law.
You've really driven this. I mean, you've been driving this for a long time. time,
Yeah.
and it's finally here that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. So obviously you have great concern. It is your responsibility, but what does it allow you to do? What will the conservation law allow you to do?
Well, I would rather speak about what it allows the Department of Environment to do, because I think that there's been a lot of focus on the specific reference to the post of the director, but all that is basically the recognition that someone has to be held accountable for the responsibilities and the jobs that the Department of Environment is given under this law, and that is the director of the department. That is the way the legislation, I was told, works. I tried to get it changed to say the department, and they said no, it has to be an individual who can be held accountable. So just to be clear on that, it wasn't me going, oh, please put me down as having all this awesome responsibility.
I think it's probably important to point out as well that the law says the director of the environment or her designate as well.
Yes.
So it does not necessarily have to be Gina who does it. She can designate someone else. Another important point in relation to it, and some of the comments that I've heard from some members of the public, let's say, is a concern that the council will be controlled by Gina or the DOE directly, and that she will make herself chairman of the National Conservation Council. That's not what the law says. The law says that the membership may decide who the chairman is. So once they're appointed, you have the ex officio members, you have the designees, and then you have those that are appointed by cabinet. Once they're in place, they then decide who the chairman should be. If they decide the chairman, if Gina is on there and they decide that it's her, then fine. If they decide it's the representative from the planning department or Department of Agriculture, or indeed the nominee from the National Trust, or one of the private individuals, right, then that's fine. I mean, personally, I would think that there'd probably be an interest in trying to have one of the private individuals act as chairman, or perhaps they could decide that they would do a rotation system on it, so that everybody participates as chairman in that role. But I think it is important to note that there's no mechanism through which she becomes chairman and controls anything. Right. It is quite deliberate. There is the quorum is 7, so that's a majority of the council, and you have at least 7 people who are private individuals, as opposed to those people who are civil servants or a representative indeed from the National Trust. There are 7 other people who can control and make decisions and participate heavily to influence the decisions of the board. So I don't think people should take the view that somehow it's going to be controlled by government or by DOE. Or by Ms. Gina at all.
Right, but certainly if the majority votes to have her as chairman, then that's the way that it goes, and that's something that the public will certainly have to understand. Now, you talked about development.
Before we
Gina,
move on to development,
sure.
I just would like to say, though, that in terms of what the law allows the Department of Environment to do, I mean, one of the things that we don't have right now is our conservation officers, our enforcement officers don't have any powers that are prescribed by law. So one of the things that this law does is that it does actually prescribe powers for our conservation officers and gives them what they need in order to enforce the law. So that's a huge step for us. It's a big gap for us now in terms of our ability to discharge our responsibilities. So I think that probably from a departmental perspective, that's going to be one of the biggest changes that the law will bring. And aside from that, it's going to give, obviously, it is going to set down, the law sets down the responsibilities of the Department of Environment in terms of monitoring our natural environment and our resources and having to report on those things. So I think that certainly it establishes a legal remit for the department in terms of those things that we have to discharge, and the law requires us to report on these things, etc. So I think from an accountability perspective, it actually places a lot more accountability on the Department of Environment than many of our sister organizations in the civil service.
Speaking of resources, once this law is in place, you'll obviously need more bodies, won't you, to carry out the monitoring as far as conservation officers are concerned, or do you think that it's ideally where it should be at this point within your department?
Okay, so in terms of the research and monitoring, I think that we are, fairly well resourced, at least in terms of the Marine Resources Unit. We have a need to increase our staffing in the Terrestrial Resources Unit, and we actually have funding to increase that one-person unit at the moment by another, actually this financial year. So we're going to take steps to try to do that. But the conservation officers themselves, we've been down 3 conservation officers for many years now, and we are just recruiting to 2 vacancies that had not been filled previously. So we're going to hopefully fill those gaps. That's in train. In fact, those people have started work. One of them has. The other is about to come on the 1st of December. So I think from a resource perspective, we're very mindful of the financial constraints on the government, and we have been doing many of the tasks already that are outlined in the law, if not all of them. So it's not like we're creating new work for the DOE. We're providing legal underpinning to the work that we already do.
Okay. So let's move on to talking about developments that you mentioned earlier. Is that like EIAs?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that is one of the aspects of the law in terms of the consultation requirements. So what the law actually says is that any government entity or agency who is about to take a decision or basically implement a plan or a policy that could negatively impact the environment needs to consult with the National Conservation Council before it takes that decision, and then it has to take the advice of the council into account. That in a nutshell is what it says. Now, in that consultation period, the council can actually recommend or require, in some cases, that an EIA is carried out. So there are 2 sort of different things. In 90% of the cases, the consultation will result in recommendations for protecting habitats and resources, which, for example, the Central Planning Authority may or may not take on board. Those recommendations, in order to have any teeth, will have to be put in place under the planning permission that's granted by the Central Planning Authority. The council won't be able to enforce the recommendations. They will only become enforceable if they're embodied in some other legal instrument that's available to the decision-making body. So in the case of the Central Planning Authority, that would be the planning permission that you get. If it's the Water Authority, for example, it might be a discharge permit. So this is how the law will operate in 90 to 99% of the cases. If the person or the entity that's contemplating this action is contemplating it in a way that it could impact a protected area, then the council will be able to say, hang on, we don't think this should happen. In that case, the council gets to actually say, no, we don't want this action to happen because it will negatively impact the integrity of the protected area. But that is the only point at which the council can have any kind of power to control development in any way.
Earlier you mentioned the DOE and enforcement as far as what it can and can't do, but it's a big thing in the actual National Conservation Law as it stands. Is that because the law lets your officers carry weapons? Let's just make it very general.
I'll respond on that.
Yes.
To be very clear, the law specifies that arms does not include firearms, as in guns. So that's excluded. There is a definition of arms, which the only thing that's included that even resembles a gun is a taser. Now, it includes things like pepper spray, batons, handcuffs, a stab-proof vest, all the typical sort of things that you would see a policeman with today, apart from necessarily the tasers. They are performing a law enforcement role. On occasion in the past, they've had situations where people have swiped at them with hook sticks, for example. They also have situations where potentially they may be facing someone with a loaded spear gun. Now that is potentially a very lethal weapon. So they've got to have something, some means of defending themselves if it's necessary. And of course, they're going to have the same powers of detention and arrest now as a constable would have. So they've got to have the handcuffs, and they're going to, the other stuff is really to protect themselves and to assist in controlling someone who refuses to subject themselves to detention or arrest, where they're legitimately suspected of committing an offense. But no firearms, no guns.
Right. The dynamics of land and sea, though, can possibly change the variation of what type of weapons they would carry, because yeah. Okay.
Difficult to see. I wouldn't want to see somebody using a taser
in the ocean
out at sea.
That's what I was thinking
that's
about.
Potentially difficult. And just to be clear, there, I mean, they're only allowed to carry the arms that the director, who is in this case Ms. Gina, and the governor decide are appropriate for them to carry. So they may decide that even though the definition of arms includes tasers, they may decide that tasers shouldn't be used.
Right. So is this extra arms budgeted for, or is it going to cost extra money? Yeah?
Yeah, that will have to be met by the DOE's budget.
Okay, all right.
Significant.
So, the final question, and then I'll ask you for your final points for our viewers out there. Is this the right law for Cayman at this time? It's been a long time coming. I would think that it is. But you want to talk a little bit about that, Gina?
Well, I think that the law is, at this time, the right law for Cayman, because it represents a compromise. It is not a perfect law in my eyes. It's not a perfect law in the eyes of many people who are more on the conservation side of the spectrum. It probably doesn't go far enough for many people I know. They've told me, I've spoken to many people who've told me that. But the reality is that, we are running out of time to take some steps now to put in place measures to protect the very limited, fragile resources that we have here. And I think that the law allows us to do that in a way, hopefully, that is going to be acceptable and understandable to the majority of Caymanians. I mean, I think the minister, really hit it on the head when he said that the environment in many ways defines who we are as Caymanians. And I've heard Caymanians all over, as we've gone around talking about marine parks, whatever we talk about, when we've been out doing consultations on this law before, make statements about, they feel that we're losing so much of our natural heritage and our identity. And I think that that is all tied up in the fact that we have lost a lot of our environment that we connect with in a way that makes us feel grounded. And so I think that that it's high time that we do this, and I think that it has been a long time out there for consultation, and I think we just need to do it and get on with trying to put the protection measures in place that will make a difference for our environment.
Minister Panton, just in your final words, can you speak to the public about the importance of really getting this law done, in place, because it's been a long time coming. It needs to be put in place now, and of course amendments can come later on. So for those who are out there who may be listening, and who obviously will need to support the law along the way, what would you say to them?
It has been a long time coming. It has been under discussion for quite a long time now, more than 10 years, 11, 12 years probably. I've talked earlier about what I think is the significance of the legislation to us as Caymanians, and to our children in the future. As I said before, we are on 3 small islands. Nobody's making any more of the Cayman Islands, and we have to preserve what we have. We have to ensure that the things that identify us are things that are protected and conserved as far as possible. Sustainable development requires a balance between meeting the needs of society in terms of development, in terms of infrastructure, and conserving as far as possible within those parameters what we can. It makes no sense for us to continue, and we're at a point now where everybody, you talk to everyone on the street, and there are discussions about the rampant development, the substantial development that we've had over the last 20, 30 years. We're at a point now where we need to be injecting considerations for conservation and the environment into these decisions at the same level that we do it for economic considerations, for example, because it's very important. This law doesn't allow the National Conservation Council to inject the considerations for the environment and dictate from that perspective. The National Conservation Council is an advisory council, other than in the context that Ms. Gina mentioned, where there is a potential impact on a protected area. It only makes sense. I mean, for example, if something was being done out near Stingray City, would anybody think that because that is within the wildlife interaction zone, that something couldn't be done to stop an impact that would potentially harm or destroy that? Of course, you must be able to do something like that. So those are the limited circumstances under which the National Conservation Council actually says, no, you can't do that. But other than that, they're advisory. They're advising the decision makers as to what the potential impacts are on our environment and ways that it could be mitigated. If the projects are big enough, like for example the port that we're engaged in right now, there is an environmental impact assessment, an EIA, and that goes into a lot of detail. In fact, that goes beyond just the environment, because the current one for the port includes socioeconomic impacts as well, and benefits and whatnot. So these are all critical considerations, critical issues into which we must have an injection of consideration of the environment and the potential to get the balance right, to conserve what we have, to protect our species as far as possible, to keep those things that identify us. And I can tell you, the children of today are much more attuned to environmental issues, to conservation issues, and they're going to be much more attuned tomorrow and in the future as well. And I keep saying, if we fail them today, they are going to not look very kindly on us as leaders today. And as I said before, we've been through this for more than 10 years now. And the law has actually gone, I mean, we talked about the extremes and those who are happy and those who are not with it. It started off with something that was very strong from a conservation perspective, where the council would have a lot of power and be able to say, you can't do this and you can't do that. Now, the staunch environmentalists in that case said, yep, we're happy with this, let's stick with this. But the public said, no, we have concerns about that. So we've actually gone more the other way now, where the council is advisory. We've pushed up the decision making to cabinet, because cabinet is comprised of elected representatives of the people. They're therefore accountable directly to the people. They make those decisions now. Cabinet is, National Conservation Council is now basically just advisory, except where Cabinet has already said this protected area needs to be protected. And that's when the council says, okay, you have to listen to me in relation to this. But these things, I think this law is, while it's not perfect, it's the place for us to start. It's the right time to do it. It's an essential time for us to do it. As a government, we campaigned on the basis that we would pursue implementation of the National Conservation Law. We were elected on that basis. It's part of a plank of our mandate from the people, and that is why we're pursuing this at this point. For all those reasons, plus that, I mean, it's what the people want. I'm certain of that.
Gina, you want to add any final thoughts? And as well, can you remind the public about the final date for input, as well as where they can send that information if they have anything to say?
Okay, well, the government is asking that anyone who has a comment or comments to make on the law submit those by the 29th of November, and they need to go to the Ministry of Environment here at the Government Administration Building. Obviously, if they take it into the Department of Environment, we'll make sure it gets there. So we'll welcome anybody dropping something off to us or emailing it to us, also on our email address, which you can get off of the website, www.doe.ky. The law is also up on the website if anybody doesn't have a copy of it. We have a lot of information up there that you can download and read and access in terms of informing yourself properly about the legislation. So I'd recommend that people do that. And in addition to that, we, the Minister and the Department, will be going out to the public the week beginning the 2nd of December, and we will be holding public meetings to ensure that anybody who has a question that hasn't been answered, either in this program or in the other programs that we've been on, or in any of the written material that they can access, please come out, hear the information for yourself. There's so much misinformation out there about this law that I think it's really incumbent upon any responsible citizen who wants to be informed to come out to the meetings and hear it firsthand. So we will be making the information in terms of which district, what time and where, available, hopefully, if not by the end of today, then very early next week.
Minister Panton, Mrs. Ebanks-Petrie, thank you so much to both of you for being here with us. And hopefully the public has a greater understanding now of the National Conservation Law, what it's about, how it's going to protect what we have for generations to come. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.